this. Much of what I'll show you today has to do with China being a huge component and of great interest to all in Asia, but I'll also talk about other areas of Asia. I think the first point to make about Asia is that Asia is not really one homogeneous place. It's very diverse. You may remember, those of you that are from America and are probably around my age, you may remember this cover of the New Yorker magazine from 1976, where New Yorkers viewed themselves as the epicenter of the world, and then as they looked west, they could see parts of the United States and the Pacific Ocean, and then something way out there called Asia. And recently, The Economist published a parody of that on how China sees the world, and you see Beijing very much at the center of attention, and as they look across the Pacific, you know, they see this big fissure in the ground, which is Wall Street, and even further away, they see Asia, and when they think Europe, and when they think of Europe, they think of brands like Hermes and Burberry and whatnot. And if you studied this this cover for a while, you get a good chuckle out of it, as I did. But we'll keep moving. But it's to say that, you know, China is really one of the many rising stars. And when I talk about how Asia is very diverse, when you actually just drill down on one country like China, where Mandarin is the official language, actually, only 50% of the population can speak Mandarin. There's almost 300 other living languages in China, and even when you're in a place like Hong Kong, where I'm based, the written Chinese language is actually different. It's traditional Chinese that you see at the bottom of the screen on the right, versus in mainland China or when you're in Singapore, where you see the simplified version of Chinese. And I just had a situation last week when I was in Guangzhou where my secretary in Hong Kong had written down the address for a workshop in traditional Chinese, and the taxi driver could not read it. I talked about languages across Asia. This is a chart that I pulled off the web that actually shows you the different families of languages in Asia. It isn't a one homogeneous market. There's over 2,000 languages that are spoken in Asia. As I said, almost 300 in China and over 100 in India. And just for the statisticians among us, that only includes languages that are spoken by more than 10,000 people. If you actually break it lower, there's a much higher number of languages. One of the points I'd like to make about Asia is that, you know, Asia is a place that is amazingly resilient. It's amazingly resilient because of its reaction to crisis. And if you think back to really over the last 20 years, there was the IMF intervention in the 90s, SARS in the early noughts. There have been floods, earthquakes, the horrible tsunami off the coast of Thailand that affected much of the region, and Japan more recently with their event, bird flu. I do think this creates a sense of living for the now, and that we find that Asian consumers around the region really feel that when crisis presents itself, they also know that it too will soon pass. So there is this resilience factor. And again, you see some of the images that I mentioned, earthquakes and tsunamis, SARS, etc. Again, it's a region that deals with crisis very differently than the West. And as a result, there's sort of an optimism that remains. It's a force in good times and bad due to the swiftness of recoveries. And it's also aided by the fact that many Asian cultures have this supportive collectiveness, where people leave, you know, kids leave the nest later, people get married later, people help each other. The strong family values as well are part of that collectiveness of Asian culture. You also find that in these developing economies in Asia, there's an amazing drive to succeed as well. And you know, you see 20 and 30-somethings so motivated to learn, to excel, and to profit, to succeed. You read a lot. I know Tom Friedman has written recently about, you know, the malaise in the West where people expect something for nothing. Well, certainly recent graduates, young professionals really expect something for something. You look at the most recent international education test, and I know most of you have probably seen this, but it's worth looking at again, in terms of how students that are going to college and are being tested in English and science and math skills score. And if you just look at the top 10, you see anywhere from 5 to 6 Asian nations always scoring very high. And you see how the United States, for example, I know we have many listeners from other areas than the United States, but the United States is 17th in reading, is 23rd in science, and isn't showing up in math, but I believe it was 27 from this survey. So again, you have an amazingly strong, educated population in many of the Asian countries. I like to ask people when they come out to China in particular, what's the most aspirational foreign brand in China? And typically you would say something like Prada or Mercedes-Benz, Sony, Nike, or Apple, and certainly those are very prestigious brands. But actually, I assert that the most aspirational foreign brand in China is actually Harvard College. And I think you'll understand why as I talk about the aspirational nature, the drive towards success. I think every parent, and again, you're talking about a country when I mentioned China that has a one-child policy, every parent aspires for their child to go to Harvard. And if they only speak a few words in English, they tend to know the word Harvard. I'll show you a couple of images here. One of the emergent categories that is a large spending category in advertising in Hong Kong is in the area of tutoring. And here's a picture of a lady named Amanda Tan who's become a superstar tutor in Hong Kong. You see her face on buses, you see her team's face, and it's all about tutoring your children so that they can learn faster, learn more, score higher on their tests, and hopefully get into Harvard. Here's a Hong Kong tram where you see a couple of star tutors, and another image from advertising. And you look at this and it looks like it's a CD cover. These are all English tutors that I've read in the local papers can make up to about $300,000 US a year just tutoring in Hong Kong. There's also the Japan cool factor. I know that we know that American pop culture is a big export, but in Asia, not only is American culture very pervasive, pop culture, but so too is Japanese pop culture. So of course you see on the right-hand side our good friend Hello Kitty. The whole Tokyo cool factor really is pervasive across Asia, whether you're in Korea, where I am now, whether you're in Singapore, Hong Kong, China. You really see that despite rivalries that might exist because of past conflicts or even current conflicts that you read about, also economic competition, even the economic decline that's happened in Japan, you find a very strong attachment to Japanese culture, particularly by young people, young consumers, and young professionals. And you see some of the images here from manga to products, to food, to car design, this whole sort of Harajuku style, music, film, etc. Another thing about Asia that's quite unique is the importance of convenience, how key that is to marketers. And you see a couple of images here. One is from Tokyo. You see Suica on the upper left, where you can actually use your mobile phone as your ticket when you're riding the subway and trains in Japan. And on the right-hand visual is a Coca-Cola vending machine from Hong Kong, where they have a similar card. You can't use your cell phone necessarily, but you can use a smart card to buy a Coca-Cola. You can use it on every bus and train in Hong Kong. You can use it at 7-Eleven. You can use it at the grocery store as well. It's convenience taken to another level than certainly I had experienced it before in North America and Europe. 7-Eleven is everywhere. It's a terrific store. It's more than a convenience store. Many people, particularly in their 20s and teens, if you look at a market like Korea, Japan, Indonesia, people go to the convenience store several times a day. For some people, it really becomes their stock-up shopping. They may not even go to the grocery store. In Japan, you even have parcels delivered. Since you're not home, since you're working during the day, they can be delivered through 7-Eleven. You can get cash there, you can get your food there, you can get your mail there. It really takes convenience to a whole new level. And For someone like myself who loves McDonald's, who doesn't? I imagine there's a few people who don't, but we love McDonald's. You find markets all over Asia now where McDonald's is open 24 hours, and they also have 24-hour delivery. When you think about Asia and you think about the large markets, the Tier 1 markets, this is really where many of the multinational brands have focused over the years. So if you're talking about China, you're talking about markets like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, you're talking about Jakarta, you're talking about Seoul, all these first-tier markets. But actually, the action now is in the second, third, fourth, and even fifth-tier cities, particularly when you look at China. China has, I think, 120 cities now with over 1 million people in it. And many brands are moving away from focusing on the more expensive, more crowded, from a competitive standpoint, first-tier and second-tier markets, and moving to the latter-tier markets. Li Ning is a brand that you may know. Many of you probably didn't even know about it until the Olympics in Beijing, but of course Li Ning was a Chinese athlete who's very famous. He has his own brand of athletic footwear and apparel. Their whole strategy to compete with Nike and Adidas, which are very powerful brands in China, was to go to the second and third tier markets first, and as a result they have a very strong market share and are able to compete. And you even see now that brands like Louis Vuitton are opening stores. This store is actually in Mongolia, so Ulaanbaatar. This store opened, I think, about 18 months ago. So in areas where you'd never guess there's a demand for luxury goods, highly crafted goods, there is in fact now. Also, fusing East and West, another observation. For multinational companies, it's about maintaining, bringing your international standards, but infusing local relevance. And those local relevance can be infused in terms of ingredients, in terms of value, size, endorsements, etc. And then for local brands in Asia, that's about bringing their local relevance first and foremost, but also infusing it with some international qualities like research and safety and design and even how they communicate. You see interesting developments in categories. This is a Taiwanese brand of scotch called Matisse, so it has a French name, named after the painter, Matisse, but you see how they challenge the codes in the category. When you look at these bottles and the sensuality of the shoulder, it really is less whiskey than it feels like wine or some other spirit, but it works. You can challenge those codes. So here's a local brand infusing some international qualities through design and actually challenging the category. Here's another brand that's quite interesting in the skincare area called Shanghai Vive, or in Chinese, in Mandarin, Shuangmei, two sisters. So for years you only saw Western brands, particularly European skincare brands in China that sold for a premium. But here is a brand that is made in China, made for Chinese skin, and is evocative in a nostalgic way of the codes of precious objects from probably the Qing dynasty. One of my favorites, it seems like I always talk about food when I say one of my favorites. I mentioned McDonald's before, but I think this is great. I pulled this off of a blog. Lay's, Frito-Lay has done a fantastic job in China of taking their global brand but really localizing it to the local palates. And this was a blog that mentioned the top 10 flavors of Lay's potato chips in China. Number 10, French chicken. Not too unusual, I guess. Number 9 is cucumber. Number 8 is Mexican tomato chicken. Number 7 is blueberry. 6 is lemon tea. 5 is hot and sour fish soup. 4 is little tomato. 3 is Italian red meat. 2 is numb and spicy hot pot. But of course the favorite is the American Classic, which is of course the plain brand of Lay's. But again, Lay's very much presents itself as a global brand that has been localized to the degree that it is relevant to what you want to eat. And they're very clever and they're very creative, and one of the brands I really like to watch in Asia and China. Coke has done a good job as well. Here they're using a celebrity, Jay Chou, who you might have seen, actually Probably not many people saw him in The Green Hornet. I don't think many people saw that film, but he was Kato in the most recent version of that. But they've taken Sprite, which is a powerful brand across Asia, and in China they've got a green tea flavor. So again, localizing their flavors. And something I recently spotted in Japan was wasabi Kit Kat. Kit Kat's a super powerful brand. It actually has a resonance. The name has meaning in Japan in terms of students studying, so it's become a really powerful brand as sort of a snack and an in-between. But there you have wasabi Kit Kat. I also have an image of maple syrup Kit Kat, but I didn't include it in this presentation. A lot of creativity by Nestle with Kit Kat in Japan. Sort of building on that is for international brands to leverage their internationalness. Really, that sense of foreignness often connotes very positive attributes for a brand. And if you look at different categories, I'll show you a few here. In the area of infant formula and growing up milks, you see Wyeth, you see Nestle, you see Danone, you see a lot of foreign brands in this area, and they do very, very well. In fact, at the airport this morning when I was flying out of Hong Kong, Cathay Pacific Airways had a sign up saying that you could not take more than 1.8 kilograms of infant formula on the airplane. They're cracking down on this because it's raiding all of the milk supply in Hong Kong. But because of the problems with quality and safety standards in China in this area, an international brand like this really equals quality and safety. When you look at technology, you look at Apple, for example, that internationalness is definitely underscores the innovation aspect. When you think about Coca-Cola and refreshment, that whole, looking at the Spencerian script and the very familiar red and white of Coca-Cola, it's all about dreams. And Disney, about emotion in terms of entertainment. Very powerful for these brands to leverage their internationalness. Pardon me. And then in terms of sports and entertainment, international is about cool. The NBA has done a fantastic job. You see LeBron James here. It's not always every category, though, and not to necessarily single out Citibank, but the American banking institutions and the financial sector in general, because of the financial crisis, have taken a real beating. And in Hong Kong, where I took this picture, you routinely see these protests happening really every week in Central. Success also wears a badge in Asia. Interestingly, when you think about the monograms of many luxury brands like a Louis Vuitton, they can actually trace their roots to Japan, to these Keimon family crests. So if you look at these kinds of, pardon me, if you look at these traditional crests that I'm showing you here, and then you actually compare them to some of the Louis Vuitton primary cues, you see a heritage that has been built upon. And when you talk about luxury brands in Asia, of course, Asia loves luxury. It really shows. I've got a few images here of celebrities promoting Louis Vuitton store openings, from Gong Li to looking to Seoul, to Japan, Jakarta, etc. Luxury is really, really a sign of success and really desirable, really a sign of freedom. And routinely, if you look at Louis Vuitton or Prada, a lot of these stores, but Louis Vuitton in particular, here's images from Hong Kong and Singapore, and a quote from a woman named Celeste who was waiting in line outside of the store, which is something we see quite often, and she said, "We want them because of the famous brand." What can I say? People will focus on your bag. It's about feeling confident. So again, it isn't just about conspicuous consumption. I think that is evolving, it's changing, it's moving more towards really showing a discernment aspect. It's about personal freedom, etc. It is getting people in trouble, however. Here's an image of a Chinese official who was the head of the Chinese State Railway, and there were several pictures of him that appeared in newspapers, and people kept focusing on his watch. And it was determined that he owned these 3 watches that I show here, which if you had bought all 3 of them, it would have been his salary over about 10 years' time. So he was removed from office. Another interesting thing about Asia is thinking small to win big. Here's an image of a competitor of Coca-Cola's. It's called Wahaha, and they have a cola called Future Cola. Perhaps not surprisingly, the the graphics are very similar to Coca-Cola in terms of the typography in Chinese and English, excuse me, and also the colors. So Coca-Cola, to fight this, Coca-Cola isn't going to undercut their price, even though this is a much cheaper product, but they introduced this 192 milliliter glass bottle, so it's very much like the iconic bottle we would know from the West, and they sold it for 1 renminbi, which is essentially 12 US cents. But it's very true to the brand, allows them to compete, and would you rather buy the cheaper product that's double or almost triple the size, or have the real thing? And I think this was effective for Coca-Cola to compete. Nestle has had to do the same thing. We saw Kit Kat before. This is actually their entry-level product, which is called Shark. And they also introduced a single wafer instead of, say, 2, 3, or 4 wafers together, and sold it for 12 US cents. And then, of course, you look at markets like the Philippines, India, or in this case, this is from Indonesia, you really have to take into account that the distribution is very, very different than other markets in Asia. These less developed markets, which are developing fast and are very lucrative markets, they typically have the traditional trade is a much bigger sales zone than the modern trade. And when you consider the traditional trade, look at the, how you have to compete. Shampoos, conditioners, lotions, detergents, etc., single-size servings, which essentially are competing like a towel hung over a towel rack. But again, you can stand out in this environment, you can win in this environment, you can innovate in this environment, but it is a very, very different environment to react to. And then the issue of flexibility. I think that Asia, the values of Asia are very much about flexibility. So whether you're thinking about your products and your services and marketing them, or you're thinking about your organization and how you should build it and operate it and run it, you have to really think about the bamboo. Bamboo is stronger than steel. It bends, but it doesn't break. The resilience and that flexibility that is strength. And I've consolidated this into the last 2 slides that I'll show you, which are 11 power observations, and I'll just read through them quickly with you. We covered this, but this gives a little bit of perspective, different perspective on each one. The power of diversity, that Asia is a diverse group of nations, cultures, and behaviors, and don't think of it as one homogeneous market, but many separate opportunities. Secondly, the power of resilience, that Asia's experience do make it more resilient, flexible, and nimble than other cultures. Brands should behave similarly in their approach to the market. Thirdly, the power of ambition, that consumers respond to brands that exude confidence, status, and drive, and it meshes with their sense of self. Fourthly, the power of scope. Don't focus on first-tier cities to the exclusion of other markets. Opportunities exist in these second, third, fourth-tier, fifth-tier cities, and the competition is less severe. Fifth, the power of pop culture, that Western and American pop culture is strong, but that Japan pop culture is really more pervasive in Asia. The sixth, about the power of adaptation, that you innovate by not changing your brand. You have to be true. If you have a global brand, you have to be true to your brand. You have to respect that, but you can localize your brand to suit local tastes, preferences, and mores. The power of global, leveraging your foreignness to your brand's advantage, finding that right mixology of international and local. The power of convenience. Convenience is a must in crowded and chaotic Asia, moving beyond the passive convenience to more active convenience. Ninth point is the power of image. In Asia, conspicuous consumption is evolving into an expression of freedom, as I said before, expressing yourself through who you wear, what you eat, where you travel, etc. The power of small things, that sometimes thinking small can be a big idea. And lastly, the power of flexibility, to emulate the cultural flexibility of Asia with your total brand design, your operations, and your management. I know that originally it said that I would bring you 12 power observations. There was a 12th, but I dropped it off because I didn't think it was so relevant, but I'm sure there are those among you who are curious. It was the 12th power observation was you really have to be here. To succeed in Asia, you have to be in Asia. So again, thank you for everyone's time who's joined the meeting, and I'm happy to take questions now. I see George from Cyprus. You mentioned is South Korea now becoming influential too in terms of pop culture? The answer to that is definitely yes in Asia. There's a couple of areas in particular, I think, in terms of music, in terms of entertainment in terms of music, movies, also television programming is very big across Asia. The other thing is that in general, we found in the health and beauty area that Korean skin, Korean woman's skin is generally considered the most beautiful skin in Asia. So you see skincare products like Sulwhasoo, which are gaining a lot of traction, and they're very premium, very expensive products that have been introduced across Asia now, are very popular, and even have their own retail outlets now for Sulwhasoo. And there are others that are priced more affordably, like Skin Food, The Face Shop, etc. I see another question here about are there examples of foreign brands who have failed by not responding to the market? Well, I think the landscape is littered with brands that have not followed these principles and learned the hard way. I think the most recent example that has been written about a lot is Best Buy. Best Buy came to Asia, opened their big box stores, which was difficult in some of these really crowded Tier 1 cities, like I mentioned. Oftentimes they weren't on the ground floor. It was inconvenient to get up to their floors. They were really, they tried to just replicate what they had in their businesses in other Western markets, and it really didn't work. Another good one that I'd like to mention is, and I always pronounce this differently than everyone else does, but IKEA, I-K-E-A, you know the Swedish retailer of furniture and home goods. They failed in Japan when they first came, but they came back and now they're a huge hit, and they're a hit across the region as well. But the reason they failed when they first came was a couple of reasons. They were in inconvenient locations, and when you buy things at IKEA, you need to take them home. So that's a bit difficult when you don't have a heavy driving culture. You have a culture that moves by mass transit. The other thing was that their furniture was too big. When you think about Japan or even other areas in Asia, the living areas are much, much smaller than you would experience in Europe or in North America. And they reconfigured their product sizes as well. And they're doing very, very well in Asia. So there are a lot of examples of that. Okay, I see Christopher. Sorry, I'm missing some things here, so I hope I'm not passing over people. But California wine industry, what brands have had success and others have failed? This is a very interesting area. I think if you'd asked just 2 or 3 years ago, the wines that Asia, first of all, Asians are very interested in wine. There, of course, is the culture of rice wine, etc. But in terms of wine made from grapes, red wine, white wine, there's a huge interest in that because it's considered culturally acceptable, aspirational. You have cultures that love to take on new hobbies, and when they take on a hobby, they really, really become expert at it. And the French wines benefited from this so much. But that's changing now. It's spreading, it's broadening out, and you're seeing a strong appreciation for the finer Italian wines, typically reds, and even extending to California. So that's growing very, very quickly. It's an opportunity for not just old world wines, but also new world wines. Jing Cheng from Chicago. How do Asian shoppers shop retail stores? Well, I'll tell you one thing that's hugely, hugely different, and but will change, is that Asian shoppers, by and large, and again, I'm not talking about Japan and Korea, but the rest of Asia, the penetration of private label goods is very, very small. If you look at a market like the UK, where private label purchases in a grocery store are over 40% of purchases, you look at a market like Malaysia or Thailand, the figure's like 3%. So certainly in terms of the retailers conditioning shoppers to buy private label goods, it hasn't happened yet in Asia, but it will happen. I think the other thing that differs with Asian shoppers is a really strong reliance in many markets on fresh. You may go to the modern trade, to like a Carrefour or another, a Tesco, etc., to a mass retailer to stock up. But when you want to buy your 4 fresh things, like your fresh meat, your fresh fish, your fresh vegetables, etc., many markets still like to go to the small sort of mama papa store for that, and will shop on a daily basis, whereas they might go on a weekly basis or even on a longer interval for a stock up shop. But it does vary by market, and the conditioning is changing in terms of consumers really reacting very positively and embracing the modern trade and the Tesco's and Carrefours, which are doing a much better job of providing fresh as well. So that's starting to change, but that habit still persists. Did I miss other people's questions? Has everyone hung up? There was a question about collectiveness, and I do think, well, I talked a lot about certain markets like Japan and China in particular, this sort of very tight-knit family values and collectiveness really is a value that extends all across the region. It isn't so particular to China or one place. There's an expectation in almost any market you go to in Asia that you will care for your parents, for example. But in a greater sense too, that collectivity is definitely pervasive across the region. Sorry, did I miss? I'm scrolling up to see if I missed anybody else's questions. There were a few that came in. Okay. Happy to answer any other questions if anyone wants to give me a chat text. Okay. Well, I thank all of you for your time today. I hope that you enjoyed the presentation. I wanted to make it fun, but also with some good examples that can educate us all more about Asia, the diversity of it, and how it's changing so incredibly rapidly and so different than what we may know if you're from America like me or from Europe, etc. My pleasure. Good night, everyone.